I was this close to almost not doing a podcast. On the menu today at SOJU Cafe is green tea. So grab your mugs and let's chat about what I learned through starting a podcast. Happy SOJU Friday, everybody. Thank you for joining us, our SOJU Shotties, and anyone who's new here. This is a really interesting time to be new to this podcast because this is actually the second to last episode of the season. So we're going to be on a little bit of a hiatus after next week's episode, which I'm also really excited about. But today's episode is very special because our producer actually clocked in for work this week. I think this is the first time he's worked in the last quarter. So it's been a while since he's been on the podcast. But as you can see, he is safely guarding my drink and adding a little bit of moose fur into my drink, a little sprinkle, if you may call it that. He's giving his best, trying to bodyguard. So we appreciate it. And in unison, we all say, thank you, Moose. But welcome to another episode. If you guys are new here, my name is Sarah. And on this podcast, we talk about navigating adulthood, career, relationships, and beyond. So thank you for joining us today. And I hope this episode brings you some amount of comfort, some amount of hope or optimism. I was sitting down and reflecting on what the purpose and the goal of this podcast really is. And I really do think I want this podcast to just be a safe space, as I've always said. And so I hope that is what this is for you guys and for me as well. And let's dive into today's episode. Before we get into the episode, we have our drink of the day. Today we got a nice green tea, and whenever I drink tea at night, because currently it is almost 10 p.m., I always run the risk of not being able to sleep because I'm a huge insomniac. And when I was a kid, I used to always just stay up until like 3 a.m. in the bed trying to sleep, but not falling asleep because my brain was always running wild with random things. Sometimes thinking about boys, but that is not my reality now. But whenever I drink caffeinated stuff at night, I do run the risk of staying up. So let's cheers to that. And I hope you guys are also drinking something nice, something cozy, and having a great week. Cheers. The theme of this week's episode is realizations, and I wanted to specifically talk about 10 realizations I made from starting a podcast, or 10 things I learned from starting a podcast. It might be more than 10, it might be less than 10, but roughly in the ballpark of 10 things, because I think through starting a podcast, I've learned a lot about myself, about the process of doing something new for the first time, and all the little in-betweens of that. And I thought it would be a really nice, bittersweet semi-end to the season. I know next week we're going to do another episode. I'm not actually sure what we're going to do next week or talk about next week, but I do want to bring James on next week. So it's kind of a full house and we have the whole crew. Hopefully our producer tunes in for that too. But I wanted to talk about all the positives, negatives, and in-betweens. So the first topic that I want to dive into is, what is it like starting a podcast? I'm actually not sure how many of my listeners have their own podcast or want to start a podcast ever, but I found this really interesting because I never entertained the thought of starting a podcast until last year when I started the podcast itself. I always knew I wanted some medium where I can share my thoughts and a place where I can just kind of like open up and talk about random things, but podcast was not really on that list until I started listening to podcasts maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. But my first lesson that I learned through this experience of starting a podcast is planning is good, but too much planning is useless. It only gets you so far, and then you start losing sight of what the original plan was. My example is this podcast, because when I started SOJU with Sarah, it actually started as Sake with Sarah. I don't think I've shared that before, but the origins of this podcast is it was supposed to be a series on my main channel. And so when I hit my first big milestone, I wanted to start a series where I sit down and talk about topics that were important to me. At the time on that list, there was growing up Asian American, navigating a relationship with my boyfriend, career growth, and exploring careers and different things like that. But it was originally supposed to be just like a Q&A format, just an honest place where I sit down and talk to you guys. And my plan was to actually sit down and drink sake. So I would get some sake, whether it's warm or cold. I actually really like hot sake. For anyone that has tried hot sake, it's just like so warm going down as you drink it. But eventually I decided to change the name to SOJU with Sarah. And it's pretty crazy that there was a small chance that this would have been sake with Sarah. but I changed it to SOJU with Sarah because I realized that SOJU is more of a drink that you mix into other drinks. Like there were a lot more recipes that I could think of and find that had SOJU rather than sake. And so eventually we came up with SOJU with Sarah. And there was one episode that aired, which was a Q&A. I answered 100 questions on my main channel, and that series just died off because I had so many plans for what I wanted it to be. I had an episode that I filmed with James, my boyfriend, about relationships. We did a relationship Q&A, and we both realized that we were we were kind of cringy. We didn't have that much camera presence back then. And it's so funny because looking at the episodes now, I think we're pretty natural because we've kind of learned how to act in front of a camera, but it was so awkward filming that episode with James. And we both mutually agreed that that episode would never see the light of day. Maybe if you guys really want it, we can pull out the video from the archives. But I started editing that video, and then I realized that this just wasn't a good video. And it's so funny to see the progression because back then James did not do any sort of content. And he also asked me when I first started doing content to not show him that much. And it's so funny and ironic now that he does content on his own page and he's full-time into like this social media space. And it's just such a funny turn of events. But I remember I got so shot down because that episode didn't go very well. And I think that idea just kind of fell through the cracks. And I also never had time to really pick it back up. So I realized all the planning and the thought that I put into that series all went to waste. I think a year or two went by and I started listening to podcasts on my own. And that's when I really got inspired to start my own podcast because I never listened to podcasts before that. There's a specific podcast that I really liked at the time, which was On My Mind by Ava Jules. And that podcast brought a lot of positivity and hope into my life. Like I just found it very comforting to hear Ava talk on her solo pod about her feelings, about her week, and just very relatable things that I also thought about and that were also on my mind. And I think she's since stopped that podcast, but that was a huge inspiration for me when I first was thinking about even creating a podcast. But as I was planning out what I wanted my podcast to be, I spent so much time thinking of ideas. And this is where I think I got stuck for a long time, like a couple of months. I had so many ideas for directions that the podcast could take. And a big direction that I thought I would go in was video essaying, because I love listening to Mina Lay and Tiffany Ferg and all the commentary videos that I saw online. I felt like I could also do, and I also had a lot of thoughts of my own. And so I spent a long time compiling a list and writing scripts for videos that I wanted to do. And this is something that I think when most people look at content creators, they don't think about all the behind the scenes. For a lot of creators that create longer videos or longer forms of media or more involved forms of media, there's so much pre-work and so much thought that goes into stuff that doesn't even see the light of day. And I spent a lot of time scripting out and outlining and envisioning video essays where I would have cut-ins and I would have actual research and I would talk about news articles and like have video clips and pictures and examples of things. And looking at what the podcast is right now and comparing that to what I thought the podcast would be, it's just such an interesting deviation from the original idea. But for some context, the original podcast, and I wrote down some example topics of videos that I was planning to do. Some original podcast ideas that I had were a whole discussion on golden handcuffs in the corporate space and feeling chained to your job. There was a topic called Obama Has Imposter Syndrome, where I would dive into the psychology of imposter syndrome and talk about how people who are very successful and very big also have imposter syndrome, and it's a universal feeling, which we did do a version of that. We talked about imposter syndrome in an earlier episode, but it was more from the perspective of like our lived experience of imposter syndrome and less about research-based, science-based analysis. I had an episode idea called The Death of the Tech Girly, and this was just talking about the downfall of girls who work in tech and post online, like the tech girly niche, how that's become way less idolized and adored online and why that happens. The dark side of working in tech, just a ton of different video essays with really heavy edits and a lot more research. And I think the reason I gravitated towards that is when I was in school, I used to write essays a lot. And so I'm very used to the whole structure around creating an essay. And even now, I feel like I treat my podcast episodes like essays. Like I'll go into a topic and I feel like I always want to substantiate that with examples and give my rationale, and also want to have flow through my arguments. But I think it takes more of like an informal orientation now. But that's all to say, I think I spent way too much time planning what I wanted the podcast to be, when I think the podcast could have launched way earlier than it did. I ended up launching the podcast in June of last year. So it's been almost a year of doing this. And originally I had started thinking about and planning for the podcast in the fall or winter of the year before. So it definitely was a lot of overthinking on my end. And at a certain point, after planning and scripting out everything, I felt a little bit discouraged because I didn't have a clear sense of what the podcast could actually be. And I was this close to almost not doing the podcast. When I launched my podcast, I also was so close to delaying the podcast launch by another couple of weeks because I felt like I wasn't there yet with some things that I wanted. So some small things like the intro animation I didn't have at that time. And so I kind of just like scrapped together something for the first few episodes. And the lighting setup wasn't good because all I had was like this $10 light. Like I had a vision for what I wanted the aesthetic of the podcast to be, but I didn't really want to spend so much money creating a studio space if I had nothing yet working for me. And so actually for our whole lighting setup that we have now, which is one giant studio light and some smaller lights, I only really invested into building that out midway through the season. And I started off with a $10 light from Amazon. And that was all I needed, I think. And I'm glad that I didn't spend too much time in that phase trying to buy different things and plan for different things and prep things too much, because really the growth and the journey of building things out is also what's exciting. But if you're a perfectionist, I totally understand where it can kind of get hard to put planning aside and just start doing something. So that's the first lesson, which is don't let planning get in your way. And planning is good, but too much planning is bad. I think a lot of us already know that, but just to kind of reiterate it, if podcasting or something else, starting a project, starting a new thing is daunting to you because you feel like you have to plan so much, sometimes the best things come out of having an idea and just running with it. I think the second lesson from seeing how the podcast has played out is that just because you start somewhere doesn't mean you have to end somewhere. I think I would label this podcast as a self-help lifestyle podcast. And clearly I started off from a perspective of wanting to create a video essay format or platform. And so I'm really glad that I didn't confine myself to that idea, because so many things start forming as you go along with it. And so now that we're almost 50 episodes in, I can see how much things have evolved. And as people too, I also think we should evolve with whatever life throws in our direction. And so, yeah, that's one lesson that I'm carrying with me, not just for the podcast, but for other things in my life, which is just because I am in one place right now doesn't mean I have to be in this place in a year or 2 years, 3 years. On that note, something that has been so important for me to learn through the experience of starting this podcast is that we are meant to evolve and change. And I have felt really stuck. And if you are a longtime listener of the podcast, you probably know that I've felt very stuck for the last couple of years in my routine of working a corporate job and doing social media on the side and feeling a little bit stagnant in a way because there's been nothing new to the evolution of me. I have a lot to say about how corporate life contributes to that in general. Like the cycle of working for corporations makes you feel stuck in a way. But the primary reason I felt so stuck is because I lived in fear, and I feel like I feared change. I was really scared of change for a while. And so before I started the podcast, things had been consistent, like a straight line plateaued for a really long time where I was doing nothing new. And the podcast was the first big new thing that I dived into. I know the podcast is still small and our community is still small. I love everyone in the community, and I find so much joy in connecting with you guys and sharing my thoughts with you guys. But the podcast showed me one thing, which is just that there really is no fear in trying something new. And I don't know why I psyched myself out for a while thinking that that was all that my life had amounted to, which is working a stable corporate job and doing content as a side gig and something that that I am. Like, I am just a software engineer who does YouTube, and I felt so much shame in that for some reason. And I know for some people that is like the ideal job, and I'm not discounting the fact that it is so cool to be doing those two things. But in my life for the last 3 or 4 years, it just felt like that was all I could do with myself. And so when I first started the podcast and I saw all this traction, it was almost a surprise and a shock to me that there was something else that I could do, like something else that I could share that was meaningful and more than what I had been doing already. And so I think it opened a lot of emotional doors for me in a way. Like, I get a little sentimental when I think about how self-limiting beliefs really stop us from pursuing new things. But yeah, the general sentiment is I think I came to the realization that I could do more with myself and my life if I did it. I hope that's something that I can share with you guys too, because a thought that's been in my head for a while now is just that our ceilings for ourselves are self-imposed. And so I used to ask James, I hate to use James as an example, but I used to ask James what he felt like his maximum ideal life would be. And I would always like question him and challenge him in his thought, because he would share something, whether it's like a number or a career aspiration, as like the best thing that he could do with his life. And I would always be like, don't you think you can do more? Because I think whatever goal we set for ourselves or whatever ceiling we have for ourselves is the highest that we can go in life. And I'm a huge spiritual person, and so I believe in things like manifestation, but you really only manifest up until like the threshold that you create for yourself. And this might be getting a little too spiritual, and I promise I'll like move on from this topic. But I was watching this girl recently who was sharing this thought that she had, and I resonated with it very deeply, because she said people live the lives that they have the courage to imagine for themselves. And I think that's very true, because starting new things, starting new journeys and new paths and creating new things, it all comes from a place of courage and being confident and trusting that you can do it. And without the belief system or like the mental courage to see yourself as something bigger and doing bigger things and like achieving bigger things, you don't get to that point. Like, most people just don't stumble into great things. And something that I've taught myself through the podcast is I am capable, I can, and I will do things that I really set my heart to. And maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe this is just a podcast and I shouldn't be so serious about everything. But I think this podcast taught me that specific lesson, because for a while I felt like I couldn't do things, and I couldn't succeed in new things, and I couldn't try new ventures, because why should I if I'm already at a ceiling that I've set for myself? That might be a little redundant, but I just wanted to say that was one of the lessons that I learned through this podcast that I cherish. And I'm hoping to dream bigger and bigger as time passes. Another thing that I'm trying to be more of is Delulu, because I really think that being Delulu means that you actually build more confidence to envision a bigger life for yourself. And I'm definitely not at the point where I'm going to be running around saying like, hell yeah, I'm going to get Sabrina Carpenter on the podcast. I'm going to have like a whole podcasting network and doing big things. But I want to allow myself to think that I can do those things eventually. Another reflection that I made in the process of starting a podcast is how much I respect silent work now. As a content creator, I think I'm pretty used to people assuming that all I need to do is like pick up a camera, film, and then just post it, and that I don't do any work. And that's, if you're a creator or you've ever tried to do something like content creation, I think you'll have more of a understanding of how there's a lot more behind the scenes work. But with podcasting, that was such a mind-blowing experience, because when I started the podcast, I thought it would be a couple hours a week commitment. And at that time, while I was juggling corporate and social media already, I was like, I don't really have time for anything too heavy on my schedule. And so I started the podcast, and I've had a lot of friends who have told me that they tried to start a podcast in the past and just couldn't keep up with the work and the weekly posting and the editing and everything. And I kind of brushed it off, being like, well, if I keep the podcast episodes to a certain length and I just like talk about what's on my mind and I don't put too much pressure on making the podcast episodes too refined, like it should be manageable. And oh no, that was not the experience that I had. The first couple of weeks were great. I think the first couple of weeks, I really just let myself speak from the heart and things just flowed a little bit better. I did script out a lot of the first few episodes too, but it felt more seamless. And eventually I got to a point where the weekly cadence started kicking in, and podcasting is a lot of work. You know, when movies are really well made and you don't really think too much about how much acting an actor is putting into it because the actor is just so good, or you don't even notice all the sound effects that are being done, or you don't know like the Foley artist is doing all these like manufactured sounds in the back. I think with anything in the media space, I've learned that there is so much silent work that doesn't get as much respect and regard as it deserves. And with podcasting, I think that's very true. Like if I were to put out a raw video of me trying to film my podcast episodes, it would be 3 hours of 50% ums and me pausing and not saying anything and like looking down and thinking. And the rest of it would be me stumbling across my words and having to repeat things over and over again. And so I think there's a lot of silent work that I've semi-experienced as a creator, editing my own videos and like doing all that work and filming my life and trying to get shots of things. But with podcasting, it's felt like that on steroids. And whenever I talk to my friends who don't really listen to podcasts, or people who haven't ever tried their hand at podcasting, they always get really surprised that I do spend a lot of time on the podcast. But yeah, I learned that there's a lot of silent work. However, one thing that I want to carry into my work, whether it's online or my creative stuff or my ceramics, it's just that I want my work to have silent effort, you know? Like, I don't know if that makes sense, but I want the things that I put out into the universe to feel seamless and to feel effortless, but of a certain quality and caliber of work, because I think I'm not fully there yet. Even for my main channel videos recently, I felt very bad about them. I'd like to say that I'm proud of every single thing that I put out onto the internet, but sometimes I feel like I rush things. And even with the podcast, there's been weeks where I'm not really in the mood to talk and I kind of like force an episode out and it feels like maybe a rehashing of a previous episode or just a really poorly done episode, or I'm like speaking weirdly. And I think I'm trying to put more silent effort into my work, if that makes sense. Another thing that I experienced in the process of starting this podcast, which I haven't spoken very openly about because I don't want to create any I just don't want to start anything, but I think the podcast has been a source of inspiration for a lot of other podcasts or platforms where people speak. And specifically, I know that because people have told me that they took heavy inspiration from my podcast to start something. But there's been times where I've seen like glimmers of the exact things that I've said or the exact ways that we do things on the podcast where it's shown up in other people's platforms, or that people have told me directly that they got the same equipment as me or like directly taken inspiration from a specific thing that I've done. I don't want to get too much into the specifics of it, but I was a little bit salty at a certain period in time because I felt like so much of the work that I put into creating cute things in the podcast or creating like a vibe or little segments and like games that would just be like ripped. But that's another thing that I learned being a creator just in general, is that copying and taking inspiration from people is just the nature of creative work. And I won't dive too much into this. I've come to accept that copying and taking heavy inspiration from people is just part of the game. And like, obviously I took inspiration from other podcasts too. So it's not like this is completely new, but that's just like one unexpected thing that I've had to navigate in this era of my life, starting a podcast, is just instances of copying and directly taking from what I say, what I share, and what I do with a podcast. Anyways, that's a little bit too much of a deep dive into something that I experienced through the start of the podcast.
Juices with James.
Intermission time. Today's intermission, we have Welch's fruit candies or fruit snacks.
Did we like lose budget for this show or something? Why is our drink and snack selection so poor recently?
It's literally what we have.
Am I about to get laid off?
What does this have to do with you?
Just budget cuts or what?
I don't pay you anything. Anyways, while we consume our Welch's snack candies, not sponsored, the theme of today's episode is things you've learned through starting a podcast or realizations you've learned through starting a podcast. And since you are our beloved host, by the way, co-host. Oh yeah, sorry. Oh, forgot the takeover was
Did you give me the host position or something?
Because you're our beloved co-host, I wanted to turn the mic to you. What are some things that you've learned or realized since doing the podcast? Also, do you have a favorite snack candy color?
The grape one? This is a red one, not a grape one.
Tastes great.
It does taste great. Okay. There's a few things I learned about podcasting, or learned through podcasting, I should say, which is one, I tend to caveat a lot of the things I say.
Yeah.
And I think it comes off as, I don't know, wishy-washy or unopinionated. Sometimes it comes across as thoughtful, but other times it comes across as like overthinking. I think it's definitely overthinking. So I feel like as much as I want to be understood by people and not come across a certain way, I have to make peace with the fact that I just think certain things or believe certain things and don't need to always qualify it. So I think that's one thing. I think another one is that I am very articulate, I think, but I don't talk well. I say like a lot. I talk very like staccato-y. I don't talk really like fluidly. I have weird choppiness in the way that I talk, and Sarah gets to really notice that, and Ari, our editor, gets to notice that a lot too, because the way I talk is so choppy, and then they have to edit it down. And then also that there's a ton of work that goes into podcasting. I'm sure Sarah mentioned it, but Sarah does all the hard work on the podcast, which is editing it, branding, getting the videos out every week, thinking of episode topics, and I think that is underrated as something that is difficult. And I think that's because a lot of podcasters actually have big teams around them. A lot of them actually say podcasting is the easiest medium that I've ever done. It's because they have teams that edit it for them and produce it for them. And Sarah is like primarily a one-woman show. So I think it's just like, wow, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And then the last thing, it has made me think a lot about content in general and how it works, because I would say when we talk about our inner thoughts and life experiences, in the beginning it was pretty easy because we have like a lifetime of experience and reflections and like themes that we have thought about in our lives. But as we've explained a lot of those and talked about some of those to you guys, it is really easy for the topics to become or feel a little bit repetitive, I guess. And not to devalue the episodes that we've done, especially later in this season 1, but I can see how the audience might feel it's somewhat repetitive. I don't know, there's like something to be said about, you know, movies or TV shows where it ends at a certain point where it's like an artistic ending or a poetic ending, versus like kind of dragging it out. And let's say like The Office had 2 more seasons than it should have or something like that. That kind of makes the show end on a note that's like less than what it used to be. Like, let's say Game of Thrones. And so not that this show or podcast is ending, because we're going to come back for a season 2 unless Moosey takes over our lives and forces us to stop podcasting or something. But
he's already doing that.
And I think this season ending where it is a good pause point, and then we can go out and do Molly and cocaine and go to EDM festivals and then get a degree at Cambridge and go to Tsinghua University in China and then live a bunch of experiences that we haven't had, and then come back to you guys with more stuff or new formats or guests or whatever we're going to do. Yeah, it's made me think a lot about what does it mean to do meaningful work online if you're doing creative stuff or content stuff. Yeah.
We film these usually after the fact, but one of the things that I get to, or maybe I already talked about, is like to have a life worth sharing, you have to live a life worth sharing, and we don't do that. And so to pull things out every week and talk about a topic, a lot of them are from our past because that's, I think, when we lived the most. But to have things to talk about on the podcast requires us to actually live lives that we want to talk about.
Yeah.
It's funny that you say, or like the first thing that you said was I caveat a lot because I don't want to be saying anything that's like politically incorrect or controversial or whatever. But James says the most blasphemous things that we cut out sometimes. He'll be like, cats don't deserve rights, and then we'll have to cut that out.
They don't. I said it. I'm just kidding. Cats deserve
exactly
rights.
We're keeping that in this time.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
But you say like crazy things that don't.
I don't think I say crazy things. I just say jokes sometimes, and then I think it's
right.
Maybe
jokes.
Censored out. Yeah.
What next? Dogs don't deserve rights.
Well, that's definitely true as well.
Anyways, thank you for joining us on Juices with James. Now back to the episode.
Bye-bye.
Bye. On that topic, when I started the podcast, there were a few episodes that went viral on YouTube specifically. And I remember that was a very amazing period. And like, I was so grateful that the podcast was reaching new people, new audiences. And a good chunk of you guys, I think, came from those early episodes too, which I'm always so grateful for. However, I remember this conversation that I was having with a friend who also had a similar explosive beginning to their career online. So they started creating videos, and some of those videos started hitting really quickly. And they told me about how much pressure they felt from this beginning because they were still figuring things out and trying to develop their own style of content creation. And they also felt a lot of pressure to keep the output, like keep the momentum going. And they fell into really, really heavy depression and burnout, had anxiety and panic attacks. And it was just overall like super, super stressful to navigate. I would say that I'm grateful I didn't have that terrible of a experience navigating growth like that. But I definitely felt a lot of pressure when I started the podcast. And particularly because I didn't really have a clear sense of what the long-term vision was. And so when those first few episodes did really well, it was like a double-edged sword. Like every week I was trying to scrap together like even better episodes, trying to write things that meant so much to me. And it was easy when I started because everything was coming from the heart. And this was the first time that I was sharing things. But then week after week, when I was like pulling things out of my head and like trying to think of things to talk about, I felt like that contributed to a really heavy cycle of burnout for me, like a pretty bad, endless cycle of burnout, because I always felt like I had to say something really insightful. And maybe that's due to me, like it's a self-imposing thing where I feel like I have to say something insightful. Maybe you guys would just listen to me talk about what TV shows I'm watching right now. But to share more openly, the podcast was like the one domino that tipped over. Mostly in my life so far, I've tried to manage work-life balance. It's been not the best because there's just always stuff on my plate, but I've been able to do things including working at my day job and keeping that up, posting on my YouTube channel every week. But once I threw in that podcast, everything was completely new. Like navigating work-life balance was a new type of challenge. And I felt like things were tipping over. Last year also came with a lot of change, and that's more of the behind the scenes of my life. But I took a break from work because of burnout. I froze my eggs. So that was a big change on my body because the hormones during that period that were getting pumped into my body just threw me all over the place. And I'm still navigating like acne from that period. I really just don't know what happened to me. I just feel like I aged a lot. But I also moved apartments midway through the podcast, and relocation depression hit me so bad. Like I've never experienced depression so terribly just because of a move, but that threw my whole system and schedule and personal hormones out of whack. And so it was a really rough year for me after starting the podcast. Things felt a lot harder to do. And I think the podcast episodes, if you go back to some of those episodes, you can really tell the ones where I'm kind of like zoned out. I think our producer's also moving. He stopped working for the night. The podcast was my biggest priority for the last year. It's felt like my baby, like something that I truly love and care about. And like the community that we've built, I just wanted to continue growing that and cultivating it. And all these changes this past year and all the burnout I've been through this past year really set me down a spiral. There was like a whole month where I was crying every single day. And that was actually when we had just moved. It was a really rough time, and I didn't really know how to navigate it. But something that made me really upset during that period is I felt like my episodes weren't good. And I know as a creative, you shouldn't be putting yourself down, but just to be so transparent with you guys, there's a handful of episodes on this podcast that I don't ever want to listen to because I feel like my mind was completely blank, and I just felt like I had to share something that week because I have a weekly cadence to the podcast. And I think the lesson that I learned is to actually make good stuff and to actually put out great stuff. You have to believe it. Like things actually matter when they come from the heart. And when your heart and your life aren't balanced and they don't have a good foundation, it's not going to be as great. Sometimes I wish I didn't always talk about my life and I didn't share things, because I think about how much more simple it would be if I'm going through a depressive period to just script out a video that is not about me, just to talk about like stories on the news or like cultural events and not have to be so emotionally vulnerable. But this podcast really pushed me over the edge and made me realize that I have to have good balance in my life in order to actually do great things in life and share great things, like share actual thoughts that I have instead of putting up a front of being positive and optimistic and actually living and suffering in the background. All in all, it's been pretty hard on some weeks to pump out weekly episodes. And the harsh question that this podcast has really pushed me into is asking myself what is true to me. Every week we kind of dive into a topic that has been on my mind. A lot of these topics are things that have been on my mind for many years or many months, and I kind of like share it with you guys. But I really lamented some weeks where I felt like I was just recycling the same topics because I didn't want to talk about anything else. So yeah, that's one thing that I have navigated in starting a podcast, which is really interesting. And if you ever start a podcast where it's about yourself and you kind of just like talk about things you're thinking through, you'll probably experience something similar where you kind of get into a rinse and repeat cycle of talking about the same things or sharing like the same wisdoms and thoughts that you have. That's the other thing, which is in order to have things to share, you also have to have a life worth sharing about. That was my next lesson that I wanted to say, because on the podcast, we do have a weekly posting cadence. And when I was starting off the podcast, it was really easy to pull things out of my bank of like thoughts that I had and things that I had always wanted to share and talk about. Granted, a lot of these thoughts were in my head for many years, and these are things that I've thought about for a long time. And so it was really easy in the early few episodes to be pulling stuff out that was new and to be talking about it. But since my life's been pretty stagnant, I felt like a lot of things were starting to repeat. And I was saying the same things, and every week I would be sitting and being like, what do I talk about this week? Because nothing's been happening. Like all I'm doing every single week is going to work, coming back from work, filming podcast episodes, editing YouTube videos, posting, and then posting about the podcast on my Instagram so that people know that the episode went up. And I felt like there was nothing to share about because I wasn't actually experiencing new things. And the things that I was experiencing, I think all took a toll on me. And I didn't really want to be exploiting moments in my life, like making a rough move to a different state or freezing my eggs. Like these were all things that I didn't even have time to process, but because I wasn't living much of any other reality, that those were the only things that were on my mind. And I had to share it because I was living through it. Also, to speak from the heart, I do think this is reflective of a personal existential crisis that I have been going through for a long time now, which is the feeling of stagnancy. And when I say my lesson is in order to have things to share in life, you have to live a life worth sharing about. I felt like I've been in such a long period of pause. I had a lot of ideas when the podcast was gaining traction and had momentum to start a Patreon so that I could share more with you guys, have more episodes, have more different formats, like play games on the Patreon. I wanted to create SOJU mugs. I wanted to get into the ceramic studio, sit down and just knock out a ton of mugs that I could send you guys and like just do little giveaways and things like that. And all of those went on pause because I felt like my life was in a cycle of work all the time. And I have recently made a little bit of a career change, but I won't share too much about that because going back to what I was saying about every week, me kind of feeling forced to share what was going on in my life without actually processing it. This is the first time in my life that I want to take some time to actually process change before I get too much external feedback. But I do want to be transparent about where I felt my life was. I felt like I had a lot of ideas and things that I just put on the back burner because I couldn't let myself do it. Like I couldn't get myself out of just this stagnant pace that I was going at for everything in my life, including my job, including the podcast, including everything else. And actually, it took James telling me to think like an artist for me to really realize that I have been spending so much time living in fear of changing things up. A fun fact is I was planning on launching a Patreon at the beginning of the year, but I had too much on my plate. So that never ended up happening. But season 1 was supposed to end when the Patreon was going to launch. And I was really excited for it actually, because I have some ideas for things that we're going to do on the Patreon that we wouldn't do here. But originally the season was supposed to end episode 30 and we are nearing 50. And if it weren't for James, like really, really telling me the harsh reality that I don't think like an artist anymore, I think the podcast would maybe still be continuing after these episodes. So if you're mad that the podcast is ending, you can get mad at James and blame him for it. But he sat me down and told me that I've been thinking too much like a business person, because that's just been me for the last couple of years, whether it's operating at a corporate company and picking up like the corporate way of work, or operating a YouTube channel and having to constantly be thinking about social media strategy and like consistency and all that I haven't really let the podcast have a poetic end. And especially all the weeks where I tell him, oh my God, I feel like this week's episode is so repetitive. Like, I don't really like what I said this week. I feel like I don't have anything to say this week. He really made me think about how I don't ever let things settle. Like, I always stir the pot again once I see things settling, even though I think the natural progression of things is like on and off seasons. As people too, we should allow ourselves rest and we should allow ourselves to recoup ourselves before bringing ourselves back up and doing whatever we're doing. And so for the podcast, I think there have been a few points where I've been close to wanting to end it, but I just haven't. And so I hope that this is more of a poetic end, even though I think I've dragged it out a little bit too long. And maybe some of you who listen don't think I've dragged it out, and maybe you do think these episodes aren't repetitive. But I think for me, in my mind, there is an end to season 1 and a beginning for season 2, where I do need some time to regather and think about how to actually artistically make this a better thing for next season. Moving forward with the podcast, at least, I want to treat every episode as something I'm proud of. I want to treat things with a lot of pride, and I think that's how we should all treat our work. Honestly, I think it's because I've been working for a while, like just working a desk job and working on YouTube, that I'm so used to having deadlines and compromising like quality of things just to hit a deadline. So yeah, that's maybe one tip that I learned from James, is sometimes you just got to think like an artist. For anyone who is interested in starting a podcast, like maybe you're listening to this podcast to learn the ins and outs of starting a podcast, the really important things are figuring out what your niche is. And in terms of niche and topic, the advice I would give is just to focus on something you would really enjoy talking about, especially every week. Once you start talking about something every single week, you'll realize how much you actually like talking about that thing or not. Maybe because my mind is always oriented towards self-improvement, I want to talk about these things, but synergy is so important, and flow state is really important too. Like, having consistent flow in what you're doing with your life and what you're outputting in life is a valuable thing, a valuable experience. One thing that's been lacking in my life personally is synergy. Actually, this advice is kind of similar to the one I was saying about leading the life worth sharing about, or the life that you want to share about, which is when you have synergy in your life, you're doing things that you want to talk about, and you're leading a life that is exciting for you, that stimulates you and that motivates you. And it's just a positive feedback loop of you doing things that you want to, and that feeding good momentum towards achieving more within that. And then also allowing yourself to self-express because things align in your life. I'll use this example because I've been thinking about it a lot, but I used to do a lot of crafty things. And if you go to my earlier YouTube channel, it's literally all like DIYs, makeup tutorials, dyeing my hair, like random things that I do with my hands. And I really love that. I also used to sketch a lot, and I would draw little graphics for my videos. I stopped doing all of that. Since career vlogging, I kind of just stopped a lot of the creative things in my life, including the things I did with my hands. And so I felt like there wasn't a lot of synergy in terms of who I wanted to be and my career, because a lot of what I was doing was showing a tech lifestyle. And as much as I love the tech space, I love working on tech, it just felt like there wasn't as much synergy with who I was and who I wanted to be. And so when I found pottery, it kind of shifted my perspective on having synergy. And whenever I went to the pottery studio, I felt motivated to be creative. I felt kind of inspired. I felt very inspired actually to like do cool things and make cool things, share it with people. I felt really inspired to create a ceramic studio or a ceramic shop. And I think that's where synergy kind of felt lacking for me in figuring out what I want to do with my life. Just that what I was doing wasn't really additive to other parts of my life, whether it's how I led my life or how I self-expressed, how I even looked and dressed myself for work. And yeah, so if you're wanting to start a podcast or any medium of work, I think aspiring for synergy is a good desire. This one's kind of a mindset shift, but the podcast has really taught me the importance of finding the why in life. All my life, I've been taught to do what is the most stable or what is the smartest decision in your life. And the podcast taught me something new, which is try to find what is purposeful. Caveat, this might not be true for you depending on your circumstance. Like you might have to factor in other situations. But for me, at least, as someone who's been working for so many years now and prioritizing only stability, it was a new concept to me that I could do something that I love, that was also meaningful, that also had potential to be a career. I'll be honest, I am jealous of people that get to podcast full time and they have a whole career podcasting, and also people that are purely just the hosts of podcasts. I think about all the people that get to just show up as the host. Like the production team will do all the setup and all the lighting adjustments and set up the camera, do all the audio checks and everything. And they have production crews, and their full time is just to sit down and be a great podcast host. And that's a life that I didn't realize that was even possible. The more I've done the podcast, the more I've wanted to make this my full time. We are so far off from that though, because the podcast right now makes negative money and we make a little bit of ad revenue that offsets some of the editing costs, but the podcast currently doesn't make any money. It is a dream of mine to just be a podcaster, but I think about how some people really get to do that full time, and it makes me really aspire to do that. But hopefully one day we'll be close to something of that sort. But I wanted to bring up the concept of the Ikigai Venn diagram. I think I've mentioned that before in other episodes. It's basically this structured way of thinking about careers and what you're meant to do in this lifetime. And it's a Japanese Venn diagram. There's 4 buckets. One is what you love. So writing down all the things you love to do, whether it's creating things or art or science or thinking logically and critically, and then what you're good at. So skills that you thrive in. It might be video editing, it might be being a TV personality. And then what you can get paid for is a different section. So things that actually pay the bills, because there's some careers I think where it's much harder to make a living. And then there's also one last one, which is what the world needs. And I actually think that one fits the bill of the why for me. So for a long time, I had this Ikigai diagram of different things that I enjoyed. I put a lot of focus on the what you can be paid for because I valued stability. But for things that I loved and things that I was good at, I always had some creative skills in there, but I never had really a bucket for what the world needs, because I didn't really know what purpose I had. The reason why I never considered being a full-time content creator and leaving my job for that is because I never felt like there was a why that I was answering. There was never a purpose. And one thing that I've experienced through the podcast, which I didn't expect so wholeheartedly, is the amount of people that the podcast has reached and impacted. When the podcast had started and I had my first couple of episodes out, I remember every single day I was reading DMs from you guys and responding to DMs from you guys, telling me how the podcast has helped you guys in some way. It's made you have realizations or helped you navigate a tough time in your life or just brought positivity. And on my main channel, I know there's been occasionally people who tell me that I've inspired them to go into tech and be a software engineer or be a creator, but it's never to that extent where I feel like I'm actually having real impact in people's lives. And that might be kind of ridiculous for me to say, because I know for some people, they've told me that they've gone into software engineering because of me. But seeing the way that I've been able to reach some of you guys just through the podcast and through sharing experiences and trying to uplift this community of SOJU SHOTTIES has really rewired my brain in a way. It's rewired the way that I think about purpose. And this is the first time where I've considered what I'm doing as a hobby on the side as something that I would want to make a career. So that's something new for me, which is I would love to be a podcaster full time. I currently make no money off of this podcast, and it's been a year and it's been a lot of work, but I do it because I see the value in it. Like I see the impact it has on people, and I really just want to keep creating a positive space for people to come to, whether it's for comfort or for optimism or for hope and motivation. I just never had this sense of purpose before, and I think filling that empty hole in my Ikigai Venn diagram has been very life-changing for me. So that's something that I have been learning. And I think in a broader sense, I think answering the why in life matters too, because the Ikigai is all about finding what you really enjoy in life and also what you can provide in life and also what can help create sustainability and longevity in your career. And I never had a clear sense of what that was for me until this podcast. So yeah, I guess I also want to take this time to say thank you to you guys too, because without you guys, this podcast would be nowhere near where it is. It probably wouldn't even exist by now. And I wouldn't have so much courage and inspiration to be doing this and to be wanting to do this for a long time. So thank you guys. Anyways, I think that is a great place to end for my lessons from starting this podcast. It's been such a long year in the best and the worst ways possible. Worst ways in more of my personal life, but the best ways because of this podcast. I'm sure I'm going to have a lot of critical things to say about myself as I'm like reviewing and cutting things out of this podcast later, but I hope it was a good behind the scenes to kind of share my internal musings as I've navigated this podcast and learning how to podcast. It's just such a new skill. Like talking to a camera for 3 hours is also a new skill. And I guess like one last thing is it's also been really great to be able to do this podcast with the people I care about. I never thought James would be a staple in this podcast, and I'm so grateful that you guys accept him and love him the way that I love him. And I think this is an amazing place to kind of like share how wonderful he is too. And I am so grateful that it's been so dynamic because of him. I also want to say Moose has been a great producer despite the days that he has not worked, but we will ignore it because he is just so darn cute. But we have one more episode next week, and that's going to be the season finale. I'm planning season 2 very shortly after. I don't have a definitive start date yet, but if you guys want to keep updated, we're going to be posting, I think, some more on this page, but definitely on our Instagram. We will be posting a lot on our Instagram to keep you guys updated, and also maybe with some fun little stuff as the season's on pause. I will be also spending a lot more time in the ceramic studio because like I mentioned last week, I signed up for a pottery studio again, and it is making me so happy. So happy. There is also a new chapter in my life that I'm starting to unravel, and so I am very excited to share with you guys about this next chapter. Once I'm back, I will be taking some time to process a new journey in my life, and I want a little bit of privacy for the time being, just so that I don't feel swayed in any direction. And I know the internet can sometimes be a very brutal and critical place, and I'm trying to make sure that I'm not going to be crying every day because of any life transitions. At the end of the day, I'm just a really scared girl. I'm like really nervous about a lot of things, but a big goal for me is to just start thinking and living more like an artist in the next few months and on this podcast. So I guess that's all for today's episode. Thank you for joining on a beautiful SOJU Friday. I hope it's not raining for you guys because it's raining right now as I'm filming this and you probably can't hear it. But I hope you have the most lovely weekend or week ahead. And I love you all, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.
Bloopers.
It's bloopers.
People used to say Nutella is really healthy.
Who's Nutella?
It's my Italian girlfriend.
Oh, I haven't had Welch's since I was a child. This is like the
That's not
biggest
true.
scam.
You've
Fine,
had
we
it
had it like
recently.
recently, but I just wanted to say that.
That's like David Beckham with his wife. We grew up working class.
Yeah, he's
like, tell the truth.
We're also sitting, if you're watching the video, and maybe we look a little bit awkward, but it's okay.
Speak for yourself. I'm very comfortable
Okay.
with medium-sized Ryan.